Does Old Testament scholar Dan McClellan need a course in logic? Or is he just being a guru of gaslighting, leading his fan base to ignore the internal weaknesses of his own positions by way of distraction, misrepresentation, false allegations, and personal attack? Whichever option is chosen, the internal contradictions in his latest video, Responding to Me, on the view of lesbian intercourse held by the authors of the Levitical Holiness Code, result in the most convoluted argument by a scholar that I have ever heard. And why is McClellan refusing any additional engagement with me, including public debate? Hi, my name is Robert Gagnon. I'm a visiting scholar of the Bible at Wesley Biblical Seminary in Ridgeland, Mississippi. I've published extensively on the Bible and homosexuality in scholarly works, including a 500-page book on the subject. In a nutshell, Dan McClellan has put out a 22-minute video, melodramatically entitled, My Final Response to Robert Gagnon. Once more into the breach. Hey, Dan, you're not a superhero just because you remain fascinated with comic books. This video by McClellan was in response to one of my videos, Is Dan McClellan Right that Ancient Israel Accepted Lesbianism? There I had shown why his apparent view that the authors of Leviticus 18 and 20 had no problem with lesbian intercourse had to be wrong. But now McClellan is claiming that he always thought that the authors of Leviticus 18 and 20 probably rejected same-sex intercourse. Yet McClellan failed to mention this salient concession in 95 minutes of prior video response to me, or even in his only written publication on the subject of the Bible and homosexuality. What's more, this newly revealed concession is in direct contradiction to his conclusion that the authors of Leviticus 18 and 20 did not, quote, universally condemn any and all homosexual practice. He alleges that I strawmanned and misrepresented him. Yet paradoxically, he continues to maintain that the Levitical prohibitions of male same-sex intercourse do not even imply a prohibition of female same-sex intercourse. On top of that, McClellan still thinks it is possible that they accepted female same-sex intercourse. What? Let's review then what McClellan said in his prior two video responses to me about Leviticus 18:20 and the issue of lesbian intercourse. In his first 45-minute response to me, entitled Responding to Robert Gagnon, McClellan used the absence of explicit mention of female same-sex intercourse as a basis for denying that
any and all homosexual practice is universally and eternally condemned. The text doesn't support that at all.
He also cited approvingly Jewish scholar Jacob Mgrims, author of the acclaimed 3-volume Yale Anchor Bible Commentary on Leviticus, saying
that Jacob Mgrim agrees with me that these passages in Leviticus 18 and 20 are limited only to male same-sex intercourse, and this raises one of my big concerns with Gagnon's attempt to assert the universality of this morality.
Mgrim stated that, quote, it is incorrect to apply this prohibition of male same-sex intercourse on a universal scale, unquote, by which he meant, 1, it doesn't apply to Gentiles outside the Holy Land, and 2, it doesn't apply to women. This in turn meant for Mgrim that it was permissible for females, even female Jews, to engage in lesbian intercourse. Mgrim inferred from the empirical fact that the prohibitions of male same-sex intercourse in Leviticus 18:22 and 20:13 are not combined with explicit prohibitions of female same-sex intercourse. He inferred that female same-sex intercourse then was acceptable, and McClellan affirmed this to be a point of agreement that Mgrim had with him. Indeed, McClellan still insists in his latest video that
the notion that female same-sex intercourse is implicit in Leviticus 18 and 20 is not true.
As if that were not enough, McClellan also reiterated this conclusion on multiple occasions in his second 50-minute response to me, entitled Responding to Claims About Homosexuality in the Bible, my final response to Robert Gagnon.
My contention is that these prohibitions are only relevant to male Jewish people and anyone residing within the land of Israel, as I have always said. And as I have already noted twice, this prohibition in Leviticus 18 and 20 has absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with female same-sex intercourse, so it is very clearly not a universal prohibition on any and all homosexual practice, even if we understand it to apply beyond the land of Israel to people beyond the house of Israel. It still is quite explicitly limited to male same-sex intercourse. Leviticus 18 and 20 only apply to male same-sex intercourse and so conspicuously omit female same-sex intercourse. And so, irrespective of how widely we extend the scope of that prohibition in regards to the identification of Israel, it still does not apply to female same-sex intercourse. I'm only wrong if we rope in Romans 1, which is not a part of Leviticus or the Hebrew Bible.
How is it possible, in any reasonable sense, to read these remarks as saying that the authors of Leviticus 18 and 20 probably rejected female same-sex intercourse? Bottom line, McClellan's claim that the prohibition of homosexual practice in Leviticus is not, quote, universal morality and not, quote, universally condemned on the grounds of an absence of an explicit prohibition of female same-sex intercourse requires the intermediate premise that the authors of Leviticus 18 and 20 had no problem with, permitted, or accepted lesbian intercourse. Here are McClellan's two explicit set of statements. A. Starting point. The authors of Leviticus 18 and 20 do not explicitly prohibit female same-sex intercourse. C. Conclusion. Therefore, homosexual practice is not universally condemned, and the authors of Leviticus 18 and 20 do not put forward a universal morality. The only way to get from the starting point A to his conclusion C is to presuppose an intermediate premise B, namely, the authors of Leviticus 18 and 20 do not reject female same-sex intercourse. Otherwise, if you say, as McClellan now concedes, in response to my video, quote, I think the authors of Leviticus 18 and 20 probably rejected female same-sex intercourse, unquote, then you can't reach the conclusion that homosexual practice is not universally condemned, at least so far as same-sex gender is concerned. The extent that one concedes that the authors of Leviticus 18 and 20 rejected lesbian intercourse is the extent that one must admit that they are treating the prohibitions of male same-sex intercourse as, quote, universally condemning homosexual practice, unquote. McClellan should have revised his conclusion, but he hasn't changed his conclusion, which means that McClellan is affirming two logically contradictory statements. Yet McClellan accuses me no less than 7 times of creating, quote, a straw man, and 3 times of, quote, misrepresenting him, once wildly so, for something that he never previously divulged to me, nor did he state it in his book chapter on homosexuality, and which contradicts his conclusion. So that's 10 times total, averaging out to once every 2 minutes in his video, and it's all about the same thing. He operates on the rhetorical premise that if he repeats himself ad nauseum, that it becomes more and more true. The totalitarian adage, the more you repeat a falsehood, the more it becomes true, appears to be McClellan's rhetorical strategy. So, in his rejoinder to my video response on Leviticus and lesbianism, McClellan now, for the first time, claims to me that he thinks that the authors of Leviticus 18 and 20, as regards female same-sex intercourse,
they probably would have rejected it as well.
This is a startling concession or admission, which in its strongest form appears at the 11-minute mark of his video. It should destroy McClellan's previously stated conclusion that the authors of Leviticus 18 and 20 did not universally condemn any and all homosexual practice. But sadly, it doesn't. It rather becomes an occasion for McClellan to gaslight his audience. Let's start with the beginning of McClellan's video, where already this gaslighting becomes obvious. Does the absence of an explicit prohibition of woman-female intercourse in Leviticus 18 and 20 mean that the authors would have had no problem with lesbianism? Old Testament scholar Dan McClellan thinks so, but is this Dogma Dan talking or Data Dan?
This is a pretty flagrant straw man.
How could it be a pretty flagrant straw man when everything that McClellan previously said to me confirmed that he thought this? How was I supposed to guess that McClellan thought the authors of the Levitical Holiness Code probably rejected female same-sex intercourse when such a concession not only was unstated in his prior responses to me and in his only published work, but even more necessitated the dismantling of his very conclusion that they did not universally condemn both male and female homosexual practice? And why didn't he make this concession previously? The answer is obvious. Because he would have been arguing directly against himself. It is not as if this was a tangential omission on McClellan's part. At best, it was an intentional and conspicuous omission for purposes of damage control. At worst, he actually didn't hold that view at the time of his first two video responses, and is only saying it now as a face-saving move. Either way, he still doesn't recognize the logical contradiction, with his conclusion denying that homosexual practice is universally condemned. This shows either how logic-challenged McClellan is, or what a gaslighter he is. Nobody is contesting that Leviticus 18 and 20, as a factual matter, do not contain an explicit prohibition of female same-sex intercourse. We can all see that with our eyes. What is being contested is what can be inferred from its factual absence about the attitude of the authors of Leviticus 18 and 20 toward female same-sex intercourse. McClellan still insists that it means that readers, quote, cannot interpret Leviticus 18 and Leviticus 20 to be universally condemning any and all homosexual practice. Yet if the authors of Leviticus 18 and 20 probably rejected female same-sex intercourse, then readers should interpret the prohibition of male same-sex intercourse in Leviticus 18:22 and 20:13 to be probably condemning any and all homosexual practice, even if capital sentencing is in question. Be sure to stay tuned for part 2 of my video response to Dan McClellan on lesbianism and the Levitical sex laws. God bless.